Good evening. My name is Titcomb, and I'm a principal planner with Snohomish County PDS. Next slide, please. This evening, I will focus on the land use element of the comprehensive plan, along with my colleagues Steve Skorney and Matthew Siddons. Next slide, please. This briefing will include a description of the purpose and regulatory context of the land use element, although the focus will be specifically on the proposed changes to the element. I will also summarize the public comments that the county received during the 30-day public comment period on the preliminary drafts. A detailed staff report was provided in advance of this briefing, along with all proposed policy amendments and findings in attachment A, all proposed narrative amendments in attachment B, and the findings for the proposed narrative amendments in attachment C. So this presentation will be organized primarily by sub-element of the land use element, and I will make an effort to pause in between each sub-element for questions, although please stop me anytime with any questions. Next slide, please. So the Growth Management Act, or the GMA, is the central driver behind the land use element, as land use and rural elements are two mandatory elements pursuant to RCW 3670A070 that the county has combined into the present land use element. The land use element is comprised of interrelated land use goals incorporating resource, rural, and urban areas, which form the basis of the county's land use strategy. And the strategy is to provide for a supply and distribution of land use types to accommodate the majority of the county's population and employment growth within urban growth areas. Strategy also aims to reduce land-consuming urban development patterns and provide structure for urban development within neighborhoods and centers. It reduces development pressures and patterns of sprawl within rural areas. It conserves agricultural, forest, and mineral resource lands of long-term commercial significance, and it preserves and protects open space, scenic, and cultural resources. The land use strategy is fully described within the 15 sub-elements and accompanying maps of the land use element. Each sub-element includes goals, objectives, and policies that all work together to carry out the land use strategy. The maps of the land use element, like the FLUME, or the Future Land Use Map, and Open Space Map, will all be presented at a later or separate Planning Commission briefing. Next slide. Next slide, please. So that was a short description of the land use element overall, and this slide begins to describe the sources of the proposed policy and narrative amendments to the land use element. As you can see, the sources are varied, although the primary drivers of the amendments proposed for the 2024 update include state regulations, regional policies, countywide policies, and public input. Multi-county planning policies, or MPPs, are more regional in nature, and they are encapsulated within Vision 2050, produced by the Puget Sound Regional Council, or PSRC. The MPPs were last updated in 2020 to have a new focus on equity and a continued focus on efficient use of urban land. The countywide planning policies, or CPPs, were revised to incorporate the amendments to the MPPs and therefore also have a new focus on equity, as well as a renewed focus on urban infill and compact growth. Updates to the comprehensive plan overall, and specifically within the land use element discussed today, aim to bring the countywide policies to the unincorporated Snohomish County area. The CPPs were revised in 2021 in coordination with Snohomish County tomorrow. This cooperative planning process also generated 2044 initial growth targets for the county in 2022. These allocate projected populations and employment growth within city and county areas using the Office of Financial Management's population projections and guidance, as well as guidance from PSRC's Vision 2050. The initial growth targets indicate a need to increase urban growth accommodations and decrease rural growth accommodations. The growth targets are a large influence on proposed amendments in the land use element, as I will describe shortly. And another important influence has been the public input received during the 30-day public comment period for the preliminary draft policy amendments. Finally, the proposed amendments are also influenced by the plan's vision statement and an objective to streamline and reorganize the element to be more user-friendly. Next slide, please. So this briefing will focus primarily on the proposed amendments to the land use element's goals, objectives, and policies, although I will also provide a brief refresher on the vision statement because one of the new sections proposed for the land use element's narrative focuses on how the element helps to further the vision. Each of the 15 sub-elements of the land use element are typically defined by one goal and each have introductory text to help set the stage for that goal and subsequent objectives and policies. The introductory text of each sub-element includes proposed amendments to better align with the current state of the county and to align with the proposed policy amendments. All proposed narrative changes can be reviewed fully within Attachment B, and their findings are located within Attachment C. The currently adopted land use element includes over 300 existing policies spread across 14 sub-elements. The proposed amendments for the 2024 update could impact over 200 policies, and the county is also proposing to add a new sub-element focused on equity. The proposed major amendments within the land use element also include revising a number of policies throughout the element to better align with the initial growth targets from the CPPs that indicate 3.3% of growth should be accommodated in rural areas, whereas 96.7% should be accommodated in urban areas. There are also entirely new objectives and policies proposed within the center sub-element to incorporate changes from the MPPs and CPPs, and there are proposed new and revised policies within the agricultural sub-element to support the restoration and preservation of agricultural lands. The major amendments described in this slide provide an overarching summary of what staff feel are the biggest proposed changes in the element, and the future slides within this presentation will go into more detail on each. Next slide, please. The minor and housekeeping amendments summarized on this slide represent items that the county feel will improve the land use element, although are not likely to create drastic changes overall. For instance, the reorganization of the annexation and anticipation policies do not propose new information or process to comprehensive plan. Instead, these are changes to collect the existing information in one place that will hopefully be easier for all to find and to utilize. The housekeeping changes proposed throughout the element amend items such as formatting, the update dates, remember policies, and strive to utilize more inclusive language. So before I begin discussing the proposed changes within each sub-element, I will first go over the plan's vision statement on the next slide. Next slide, please. So last month, the Commission was briefed on a newly proposed vision statement within the introduction of the Comprehensive Plan. And this slide is a reminder of the plan's vision for 2044, primarily that we're all in this together. So the land use strategy and the policies within the land use element were reviewed through the lens of the vision statement. And part of the rationale for amendments to new policies and the new equity sub-element is to ensure that the land use element can help move the county towards the shared vision for the future. The land use element supports the vision statement through policies focused on fostering neighborhood communities and strengthening community connections with transit and land use. The element further does this by incorporating equity into all aspects of land use planning and directing growth into urban areas that are vibrant with people, uses, and resilient design. The land use element also helps to ensure that the county grows responsibly to promote livability and equity, while also valuing the natural environment with policies aimed at preserving and connecting open spaces, as well as protecting and restoring resource lands, bolstering a strong economy, and protecting the cultural resources and rural character that makes Snohomish County unique. Next slide, please. Oh, sorry. I'm sorry. Commissioner James, you have your hand up?
Yes. What's the current vision statement?
So there is a current vision statement.
That's why I didn't know what it was. Okay. All right. Thanks.
Yeah, of course. Right. So now begin to focus more specifically on proposed policy amendments within each sub-element, starting with equity. Next slide, please. So a new equity sub-element is proposed within the land use element to be consistent with the vision statement, as well as with Vision 2050, the CPPs, public sentiment, and the executive's June 12, 2020 proclamation on social justice. So planning decisions have historically upheld and instituted social and racial inequities, and the new introductory narrative, goals, objectives, and policies within the equity sub-element acknowledge this history and commit to improving the county through measures like eliminating barriers to public participation and decision-making, identifying historically and currently marginalized communities, and making investments that meet the needs of current and future residents and employers, particularly in historically and currently marginalized communities. The new sub-element helps demonstrate Snohomish County's commitment to equitably and meaningfully engaging and planning with historically and currently marginalized communities. You may also notice that the numbering for the sub-element's goals and policies include EQ. So there's a desire to put this new sub-element at the beginning of the land use element to show its importance, and because its goals and policies are not specific to any one area or sub-element. So adding the EQ to the goal allows the sub-element to be on the top of the land use element without the large housekeeping task of then remembering every other policy within the land use element. So the new goal shown on this slide as LUEQ1 combines a new CPP central principle with definition of equity in CPPs. The new CPP principle reads that the county should, incorporate equity and inclusion into all aspects of countywide and local planning. The county felt that it was important to also include the definition of equity within the goal, so there was no future confusion if the goal were ever copied and pasted for use outside of the context of the sub-element. Language throughout the sub-element focuses on historically and currently marginalized communities. Although the CPP definition and the preliminary draft policies that went out for the public comment included only historically marginalized communities. Although we heard from the public that communities are not only historically marginalized, they can be currently marginalized. And the county changed the proposed language to be cognizant of this reality. Next slide, please. So the previous slide displayed the newly proposed goal and 2 objectives of the equity sub-element. And this slide highlights one new policy, LUEQ1A1 in particular. This policy is highlighted as it will be important for the implementation of many other proposed equity policies. For instance, policy 1A2 indicates that the county shall reduce disparities in access to opportunity. And understanding where disparities exist is a necessary step in this process. Similarly, policy 1A3 indicates that the county shall make investments that meet the needs of current and future residents, especially in historically and currently marginalized communities. To fulfill these policies, the county must understand where the focus should be, and the county believes that this can be accomplished comprehensively through geospatial analysis as outlined in policy 1A1. Next slide, please. So before we move on to the UGA sub-element, are there any questions about equity? Yep, go ahead, Commissioner James.
Yeah, just I'm wondering what existing, can you back up the slides there so I can see what slide says again? There we go. Are we assuming that there are these sorts of problems that need to be fixed, or are we just, is this just a blanket statement in case it ever happens? And I didn't quite understand what was inequitable about the way things were written beyond this or outside of this.
Yes, this is the aim of this overall sub-element is to blatantly explain that we want to be an equitable and inclusive and accessible county. And part of the way that we think we can do that is by, as this policy suggests, utilizing geospatial analysis like GIS to help identify historically and currently marginalized communities that we believe exist in the county. And if there are, this will help us to inform equitable policies and plans and distribution of funding. So funding overall could be a big aspect of this.
Yeah, that was one of the things I was concerned about, or it popped into my mind, was the funding part of it. And I realize we're not the legislative body, but that's where my mind goes as a council member. But we're advising the legislative body, however. And I'm sure that they'll look at this as well. Yeah, I can't think of examples, and I was going to ask if you could give me some examples of some of the things that you're concerned about here. Like land use strategies on EQ1A, land use strategies shall work to eliminate barriers, ... How are they going to work? And I didn't realize that land use strategies worked, but apparently they work to eliminate barriers, it says. So it's like, it's just some of the language was odd, and what it was trying to fix was not really defined, because I didn't see that there was outlined that there were any problems to fix in this area. So that's why I was hoping to get some examples to make it more concrete for me. Sorry, I wrote all these things down earlier when I was going through the information, but also in EQ1A, is the very strong language shall be incorporated into all aspects of land use planning. What does that look like? And, it just left me wondering with a big, huge question mark. What is this about, and how is it going to be implemented? It seems very definite. And then the mapping part of it on EQ1A1, I had to look that up on Google to find out what equity mapping was. I learned a little bit, but I thought maybe, again, that's a lot in a little bit, but this is a whole new sub-element, so I guess it deserves a little bit of Q&A and conversation, right?
Most certainly. And I think I'll address parts of what I'm hearing, and also I see your hand, Commissioner Eck. And so, one second. So I think an example, for instance, of geospatial analysis is what the county is currently doing to look at climate change impacts and the vulnerability of certain communities that may be able to be less or more resilient to those impacts. So that's kind of an example of how geospatial analysis can work to help us identify areas that need potentially extra help or help in general. And part of I think the way that we implement the goal is through the objectives and the policies therein. But also I want to be sure to give you a more of a full answer, including some potential implementation that may be better suited after this briefing, and also potentially after Commissioner X's question.
Yes, thanks, Sarah. I just want to comment and maybe ask a question, and certainly we can have more conversation after your presentation. I am delighted that this language is being added. I think it's important to have this line in the sand and make it very visible and in the forefront so that everything built around it syncs up. I'm thinking about equity in lasting effects of redlining, and how we do have a lot of vulnerable populations still living near freeways and breathing air that is not healthy, closer to airports where there is noise and pollution. So I'm imagining that's probably the type of thing that you're talking about.
That most certainly. Oh, sorry. That most certainly is part of the process, and I think one way that we want to comprehensively address this question or this issue or potential issue is that we don't really know what we don't know. And so this policy, for instance, shown here on this slide will help us figure out what areas we need to be looking at. So right now, if you're asking me for an example of a community that is marginalized or currently or historically, we can talk about climate change impacts and vulnerabilities, but there are many other factors that play into it being historically and currently marginalized. And so I think part of these policies are to help the county determine the next steps and figure out where we can be going and should be going. And I don't know if Commissioner James, that answers fully your questions, although I think we can also continue the conversation after the presentation and through email if that would be helpful.
Yeah, no, that'd be great. Thank you. I appreciate that. Yeah, we always want to protect the folks that need protecting. Absolutely. Don't want to be taken the wrong way. And but we're also forcing growth into the urban areas, which means they're going to have issues around freeway noise and breathing pollution and things like that, and you know, all of the other things that we're talking about. So it just seems like this is maybe more of a, like you said, it's sort of a pre sub element to let people know while you're planning to keep this in the back of your mind. Let's protect the people. If we're going to build something next to a freeway, which is obviously going to happen and has already, but we're going to not stop with where it is now. It's got to continue, right? I mean, we're up in the numbers. So when we do build those areas, be cognizant of some of these things, and let's not put anybody at a disadvantage. That's how I'm taking it, but it just seems the language is pointing maybe to some other unknown. And it seems like it's pulling from examples. And then when I looked at the briefing for the staff briefing, it actually talked about public input was incorporated into this language. So that told me that there were actually examples of people who were complaining. And that's why I was kind of wondering and say, who are they and what has happened and what can we do? I'm just more of a detail and specifics kind of a guy rather than the broad overstroke. Seems like it covers a lot, and you can end up covering things that don't need to be covered, maybe, or maybe shackling growth in a certain way that it isn't really necessary if you have too broad of a statement, especially with strong words like shall instead of may or could or please keep in mind or we will be cognizant of as we move forward. So those are the little red flags to me anyway when we're writing language of policy and especially this is a 10-year plan, so kind of important to get it right and be able to cover things we can't see. Like you said, we can't predict the future. We don't know who is going to need protecting, you know, as we build. But those are the things I think about. So yeah, no, we can continue discussion afterwards, but I know that once we leave this area, we won't be talking about this part of it until at the end, if somebody remembers to say something. So wanted to bring it up now because you did invite us to ask questions. So I did.
Yes, thank you. I definitely welcome questions throughout this, as this is going to be there's a lot of information coming. And so being able to communicate about that as we go, I think will be helpful.
Cool.
So thank you, Commissioner James. Commissioner Campbell, your hand is up as well.
Yeah, thank you, Commissioner James, for your question, and Commissioner Eck for your endorsement of the language. I think it is sends an important signal. I think the toolkit is challenging to figure out, Commissioner James, about what one really can do, but you keeping it front and center in our minds. From the climate group that I chair, there's been a lot of work on health equity disparities. There's a state and a county map on disparities where they exist. And it's based on a number of different analyses, whether it be access to transportation, healthcare, pollution, and the like. So there's some pretty good geospatial mapping and as she mentioned, with the vulnerability assessment. So bringing that into our kind of thinking once we get to some of that and how land use and the different elements of the comp plan might support greater access. I see it less as protection as it is access and responsiveness to conditions that exist on the ground. So thanks for your question. I just wanted to add that in because there is a fair amount of detail and pretty sophisticated analysis on this issue.
Thank you, Commissioner Campbell. Okay. Taylor, if you could move us to slide 13, please. So as the name suggests, the urban growth area subelement focuses on all things urban growth area, related to including accommodating population forecasts, encouraging infill, maintaining an urban growth boundary, and clarifying when a UGA expansion can or cannot occur. So one of the major influences on the land use element is the initial growth targets approved by County Council on February 23rd, 2022, as well as the regional growth strategy of Vision 2050. So Vision 2050 changed the necessary accommodation of population within UGAs of the county from 91.5% to 95.5% and reduced the rural accommodation from 8.5% to 4.5%. This change is reflected in a proposed amendment to Policy 1A1, as well as throughout the element. For instance, proposed amendments to Policy 1C2 help discourage unique design regulations along UGA boundaries that could work to discourage urban infill or all available within all of available underutilized lands. As I briefly mentioned a few slides ago, the CPP has actually adopted slightly different initial growth targets from Vision 2050. The CPPs indicate that the urban growth accommodation should be 96.7%, and the rural growth accommodation is 3.3%. This is because the CPP numbers include more recent population-based figures from the 2020 census instead of the 2017 base year used by Vision 2050. To be responsive to both Vision 2050 and the CPPs, Policy 1A1 in the EGA subelement and Policy 6A1 that Steve Skorney will discuss in a few minutes within the rural subelement will indicate that UGA shall accommodate at least 95.5% of the county's population, and the population growth outside of UGAs shall not exceed 4.5% of projected growth. I also believe this was discussed last month during the population and employment element briefing. So the county has also proposed to collect all of the existing annexation policies located throughout the element under a new objective in the UGA subelement. I also want to note here that I'm not going into detail about each proposed policy amendment within the UGA subelement or within the entire land use element this evening because there are hundreds of proposed changes, although all proposed amendments are detailed in the staff report attachments. Okay, so next slide, please. Also, I want to invite any questions about the urban the UGA subelement before we move on. Okay, next slide, please. The existing goal of the urban development patterns subelement is to establish development patterns that use urban land more efficiently. This subelement also includes proposed policy amendments to help the county accommodate more population within the UGA by encouraging infill development, like in the newly proposed Policy 2A5. A major change in the subelement is also proposed within Policy 2A1, where the county proposes to increase the minimum net density for new urban residential developments from 4 to 6 dwelling units per net acre. In compiling data on all preliminarily approved land use proposals from 2018 to 2021, and all final projects from 1998 to 2017 within unincorporated Snohomish County, the majority of all projects have an approved minimum net density of 6 dwelling units per net acre or higher. Although this also means that between 7 and 21% of these projects would have had to add additional dwelling units if this minimum net density requirement had been in place at the time of the original application. Therefore, the county anticipates that implementing this proposed increase in minimum net density could result in increases in infill densities. Another proposed change within the urban development pattern subelement is to collect all transportation-related policies within existing Objective 2B. So many of these are proposed to move from the transportation element, and their reorganization will allow for the TE to focus specifically on identifying and describing transit corridors and the infrastructure therein, and will allow the land use element to focus on the planning necessary within those corridors. These amendments won't actually change the existing work or the process, although it will organize these policies in a more user-friendly way, the county believes. So before we move on to the center subelement in Matthew Siddons, are there any questions about the urban development pattern subelement? All right, Matthew. Next slide, please.
Thank you, Sarah. Hello, I'm Matthew Siddons, and I'm Senior Planner in Long Range Planning. And I'll be presenting the center's sub-element. Next slide, please. So a new objective is being added regarding countywide centers. Objective 3.A, plan for countywide centers consistent with Vision 2050, the regional growth strategy, and the countywide planning policies. We're also looking at revising policies to incorporate new center future land use designations. So the light rail communities and mixed use corridor will be introduced as part of the urban core sub-area plan element as new designations. We'll also be looking at amendments to support accessibility for people with disabilities, as well as plan for housing affordability to all segments of the population in alignment with changes that we made to the housing element. We're also looking at repealing of transit pedestrian village policies. These will be replaced by policies within the urban core sub-area plan element. Next slide, please. Within the center sub-elements, we're also making additional changes. So revisions to urban village policies for clarity and based on capital facility plans, repeal of Objective 3D, and underlying policies as transit emphasis corridors. These will be discussed primarily within the transportation element, repeal of Objective 3H and underlying policies as they are redundant, and amendment of policy 3E1 to more closely align with multi-county planning policies from the PSRC. And this is to protect encroachment onto manufacturing and industrial centers. I'd like to take this time to answer any questions. Councillor Campbell.
Thank you. I tried to go back and look at some of the different definitions, and I have to confess that we're getting a lot of different language here that's confusing to me. I mean, I almost need like a definition section, because in the population and employment forecasting, it talks about high capacity transit communities. We have urban centers, we have countywide centers, we have urban villages, we have light rail communities, and it feels like we're getting a lot of mix of different terms, and it's confusing to me about what fits for which one, and maybe we need some definitions and consistency.
That's a really good suggestion, because there is like a number of different terminologies that are being used. Within our countywide planning policies, we have some terminologies, but I think within a comprehensive plan as well, it would definitely help to have these, I guess, terminologies identified and available. Is there any other questions? With that, I'd like to pass it on to Sarah again.
Thanks. And there also is a bit more information about the centers themselves within the narrative that we've been trying to amend to kind of go along and help with these policies and objectives. Although I think your point is well taken, Commissioner Campbell, that having more information about the specifics and how they all work together, I think will be important for reader understanding and also staff and public understanding as well. Okay, can you go to please slide 19? All right, so now we begin discussing the urban design sub-element. Next slide, please. So the urban design sub-element's existing goal is to, in cooperation with cities and towns, create urban developments which provide a safe, healthy, active, and desirable environment for residents, shoppers, and workers. Sub-element also includes proposed policy amendments to help the county accommodate more population within the UGAs by clarifying that when areas become denser through larger scale developments as allowed by zoning, these buildings can be taller and of a bigger scale than the surrounding buildings and still be designed to be compatible with the existing neighborhood. This will help, in the county's mind, allow infill to be as dense as zoning would permit it with still good design. So there are also proposed amendments to policy 482 to encourage public art and public gathering places, as well as bicycle parking and green design in and around buildings. There's also proposed amendment to bring in an interjurisdictional coordination policy focused on the health department into the land use element where it better aligns. This policy discusses healthy design, and that is a focus of the sub-element. Next slide, please. So the urban design is not a super large sub-element, but are there any questions about that or things that we should be sure to take note of as we go forward? Okay, so now we will discuss the small area and neighborhood structure sub-element. Next slide, please. So the county is proposing to amend the sub-element's goal, which currently reads, to encourage land use patterns that create connected, identifiable neighborhoods and communities in the UGA. So this is different than the current goal because the county is proposing to remove the descriptor from the end that reads through a consolidated system of past and future neighborhood plans. This is proposed because the county does not create neighborhood plans, although there is the potential for the county to help in the creation of neighborhood plans in the future to implement this goal of identifiable urban neighborhoods. The most likely location of future neighborhood plans are within the urban core suburb area, or through a joint planning process with a city, or under a special grant program rather than as a normal course of business. Although with the removal of the text in the goal, it is necessary to explain the potential scope of more detailed planning processes within the revised policy 5A1. The revised policy would explain that the more detailed planning shall be done in partnership with community residents, organizations, and businesses to support neighborhoods. The amendments will also revise the characteristics of the neighborhoods and combine the previously separate policies focused on neighborhood commercial centers and commercial centers. This is because there's not a discernible reason to have specific policies related to each of those things, especially with the removal of the size limitation criteria. There was a lot of overlap that we thought could be combined into one more comprehensive policy. There are also policies proposed for repeal in the sub-element, which are focused on one specific UGA. And this could be because they're no longer necessary because the action was implemented, or because the information can be combined with a future land use destination description to help explain the implementation zones in a location where staff and the public would likely go for answers. So next slide, please. So that concludes the urban focus sub-elements. And if there are no questions about the small area sub-element, before we move on to the second half of the briefing with the rural and resource land sub-elements, I'd like to propose we take a break. Is this okay with the commissioner, or if this is okay with the commissioners, and if there's a time that seems reasonable, 5 or 10 minutes could be a good option.
Break, or
yeah.
What's our view? Any thoughts?
I propose 5 minutes. That sounds good to me.
5 minutes sounds good.
I would second that.
What are we taking a break from?
I
Not
know.
where we're taking a break from, taking a break.
Sitting in a chair.
We've been through some long meetings. This is no problem at all so far.
Okay. Well, good. Take a break from my voice for a little bit. So maybe then at 6:17 about, you come back and Steve Skorney will begin the rural and resource land sub-element discussions.
Okay, 6:17.
All right, thanks. All right. Steve, if you're back from the break, would you like to begin your briefing?
Good evening, Steve Skorney, Senior Planner with PDS. Darn, Mariners, they got 2 outs. They just need 1 more out and they'll win this game. But anyway, that's beside the point. We're going to talk about amendments to the rural lands sub-element and the resource lands sub-element. Next slide, please. So we're amending goal 6A1. It's a key goal in the rural lands sub-element. And currently this policy does not indicate the percentage of growth that is allowed within the non-urban areas of rural resource lands, but we are adding that 4.5% growth that Sarah had mentioned in the urban policies, so it's again that's much less than the current growth target for rural areas, which is actually 8.5%. So this almost cuts it in half. And again, this is consistent with the regional growth strategy for the Puget Sound region to focus and direct the vast majority of growth to urban areas. Next slide, please. Also, we have other policies, a lot of things we're revising and repealing or combining. In most cases, these amendments are being made to kind of dampen any opportunity to get rural growth that exceeds this proposed 4.5% growth rate. So, and one of the key ones was back when the comprehensive plan was first adopted in 1995, we had we had high density rural residential. And that was a designation on a lot of the rural lands, and that was reflected the zoning at the time out in the rural areas, which we had R5 zoning, but we had zoning that was less than R5. We had a 2.5 acre minimum lot size and 1 acre minimum lot size, and even half acre minimum lot size. So when the plan was adopted, there were areas like the Warm Beach senior and care facility out there near in the Warm Beach area near Stanwood that had plans to expand and provide opportunities for higher density growth for mainly for senior housing out there that as part of their healthcare center. And that led to a policy that as you may not know, but our original plan was appealed to the Growth Management Hearings Board, and we had to create this bright line of 5 acre zoning. But we were allowed to have some exceptions, like in the case of Warm Beach, which had plans to expand their facility to allow for denser rural development out there. And but the senior healthcare, this Warm Beach Senior Healthcare Center had gone to the planning, to actually the county to seek permitting to expand their facility, and they met with a lot of pushback from residents in the rural area there, and it was challenged. and this was before the hearing examiner, and the hearing examiner, because of the nature of the application, denied it, and with prejudice, and the environmental impact statement was not supportive of the development. So that was back in 2008. So since then, the Warm Beach Healthcare Center has not decided not to expand their facility. So we are going to remove that policy, and that would certainly reduce the rural population, potential rural population increase out in that area of the county. Also, we have a policy that would currently encourages rural cluster subdivisions, which is a type of subdivision process I've been before you here last November, December regarding this, clustering the density in the most buildable portions of a site in order to provide a substantial amount of open space to protect critical areas and to keep kind of a rural character of maintain the rural character of that area. But so what we're doing is we certainly have not taken it off the books. It's still permitted in our development code, but we're just not going to encourage it. And so it's a slight change in phrasing, but it's something we need to do again, as a strategy to try to reduce the rural growth rate. Also, we revised policies to encourage connection to public water for drilling new wells, and this is preserve groundwater supplies out there in the rural areas. So that also would likely discourage rural growth out there if they can't do it on individual wells. You have to create a public water system of some sort. And then finally, we wanted to also strengthen some policies that mirror GMA regarding wanting to prevent or discourage inappropriate conversion of vacant land, rural lands, to sprawling, low-density commercial development out there. And because again, we only are allowing a little bit of rural commercial out there to serve the surrounding rural areas there, residents in that area here. We're not trying to kind of generate new development that will bring people into the urban areas, into the rural areas to shop. Next slide, please. Okay, moving on to the rural lands element. Next slide, please. So the main thrust of the policies under the ag sub-element are related to providing policies that support restoration of certain ag lands, habitat restoration, particularly for anadromous fish species. And that is something that is being promoted by or required by the GMA. And so we need to add some policies. And then there's a lot of activity at the county here regarding balancing agricultural activities with fish restoration projects. And as you likely know, historically, when ag first happened in Snohomish County, it pretty much focused the river valleys where you had the best soils. But however, that's in the floodplains. The rivers meander. There are wetlands and other things, and of course, the floodplain is where the habitat is for anadromous fish, so that's steelhead and salmon. So historically, the farmers would dike and fill portions of the floodplain for agricultural purposes. So now we're trying to kind of restore a little bit more of a balance between ag uses and kind of trying to increase habitat for anadromous fish. So we have several policies related to that that we're adding. Next slide, please. However, kind of the in regard to ag activities in our designated ag lands, we are discouraging that. We as kind of to balance the desire now to provide for habitat restoration. We also need to help strengthen, preserve, and support farming activities, particularly in our designated ag lands. So we're providing stronger language where we want we're getting direction that we should look at strategies to help preserve farmlands by one sort of a idea would be to increase the minimum lot size from the current 10-acre zone to 20 acres or 40 acres, and we've already kind of run that potential strategy by the Agriculture Advisory Board. And then another one would be to mitigate for any impacts to farms from public project, particularly road work, new roads expansion, other types of infrastructure that goes through farmlands but doesn't necessarily serve the farming community. So that's kind of we're trying to balance again these two goals we're trying to achieve here. And also we have several minor amendments, including one to increase social equity within the agriculture community for those communities that have been underserved or ignored. Next slide, please. Okay, moving on to the forest lands sub-element. Next slide, please. So in the forest lands sub-element, pardon? I should have asked, I'm sorry, I wasn't looking at Commissioner Campbell, you had a question regarding the ag?
I do. Thank you. The policy 7A3 under ag lands requires the county to designate agricultural lands, based on some criteria. It appears to me that much of those designated farmlands have been just primarily in floodways and flood areas, and not really comprehensively across potential lands of long-term agricultural significance. So many lands, forestry included, resource lands, would be kind of zoned in an R5, which has encouraged the rural clusters. So I guess my question is, what is that true? And then secondly, what would it take to have a reevaluation of what the requirement is in this policy for designation, a broader designation or a broader review of farmlands of long-term significance?
Well, first to answer your question here, that is one goal of the county here is to do that sort of a reevaluation. There was the initial designation of ag land. It wasn't a haphazard approach. We actually did look at soil conservation maps and looked at the historic zoning and plan designations for ag. And there was actually at one time more ag land than the 78 or 80,000 acres we now have. But it was sort of a political compromise at the time. The area between Arlington and Marysville, that was called upland ag land, upland commercial agricultural land, and it has a high water table, famous for the strawberry fields out there. It was a political decision by the council back in the 90s to de-designate that or not carry over that farmland designation. They kept some of the A10 zoning out there. They just called it rural residential 10. But so there are areas, upland areas that would meet these criteria in terms of having prime farmland soil. So there is a push, particularly in our Linden Nunzig with West Parks, the DCNR, to revisit this and do that sort of a study and see if we can expand, because there are a lot of upland farmlands, rural areas that are under threat of development. in a few cases, there's some adjoining or nearby rural clusters that are impacted, may impact these areas. So that's going to be one of our strategies, which that new policy that we spell out here, we'll be looking at. Does that answer your question?
It does. I just, at some point, I would love to know what the timing is of that reevaluation, and does that fit within this comp plan, or is that a regulatory piece that's subsequent?
Well, it would be post-update. After we get done with the update, we will have our marching orders in terms of a work program to try to implement as many of these policies as we can,
Gotcha.
prioritize them, and certainly the Ag Board is. We're already meeting with them now, a subcommittee to talk about these types of strategies, and they're anxious to get going on them.
Excellent.
Any more questions on the ag? So sorry, I just need to look up at the hands. I'm sorry. Okay, moving on to forest lands. Just as a bunch of minor amendments to this sub-element. Nothing really. Other than we did delete some policies where, and again, this goes for some of the urban sub-elements as well as the rural and resource that have been implemented in code, and one here regarding any lands that are undesignated commercial forest lands shall provide adequate access for fire vehicles. Well, we have adopted and it's been updated fire code which addresses this, so we felt that it was no longer of any use to keep that in there. Any questions on the forest lands? Next slide, please. Okay, mineral land sub-element. Next slide. Well, this I would say this chapter in our subsection of the current general policy plan was amended recently. Again, in several of you may have been involved with that when we the county wanted to direction from the council's office here to amend policies to allow for an easy transition once the resource has been extracted from the site to get the site cleaned up and then reuse it again for rural residential use. So we've gone through that section here a couple of years ago. So now we're back here, and then so there are just a few minor amendments remaining here. There was a couple of places where we still reference the mineral conservation, the MC zone, and that's of course that's been repealed, and so we replaced that with reference to our the plan designation mineral resource overlay. I also wanted to mention that regarding no lands, we sent out for comments. The Toledo tribes reminded us that tribal trust lands or lands owned by the tribe or tribal members come in various forms, and there is a term called restricted fee lands, which in a sense they're owned by tribal members and technically are not on the county's assessor's books. So we wanted to revise to add that in there, as long as the traditional mention of the term tribal trust. And then we had several deletions of, again, we've had some policies that had been implemented in code, and there was no need to retain the policy in the plan. Any questions? Next slide, please. I think I'll turn it over to Sarah again, and I'll be back in a minute.
Thanks, Steve. So now we'll discuss the open space, shoreline, and scenic resources sub-element. Next slide, please. So the goal of the sub-element is to identify and protect open space, natural and scenic resources in shoreline areas. The county is proposing primarily minor amendments to policy 10A1 to clarify what is considered open space. For instance, the proposed amendment is to add designated commercial forest and commercial farmland areas to areas identified as open space, as this was not specified in the past, although they are open spaces according to the PSRC's Regional Open Space Conservation Plan. The proposed change is to incorporate the PSRC's Regional Open Space Conservation Plan into the sub-element through reference and through revisions like the one I just discussed. County is also proposing a new policy, policy 10B10, as the existing policies in the sub-element do not discuss the preservation of urban open spaces or those near underserved communities. This is an example of an equity-focused policy outside of the equity sub-element, as it is very focused on one topic. Next slide, please. So now we'll move on to the cultural resources sub-element, if there are no questions about open space. Next slide, please. There's only one minor proposed policy change within the cultural resources sub-element that has an existing goal to identify and encourage the preservation and enhancement of cultural resources in Snohomish County, including archaeological, historic, and arts resources. Change in the policy is based on timing, as the county is already cooperating, so the county shall continue to do so versus to start. The narrative introduction of the cultural resources sub-element also includes proposed amendments to more explicitly recognize the first inhabitants of the county, although more specific policies and discussion related to tribal cultural resources will be found in the new tribal coordination element that will be briefed at the Planning Commission in a few months. Okay, next slide. And please also stop me if there are questions here. The next element is the airport compatibility sub-element. Next slide, please. So similar to the cultural resources sub-element, proposed amendments to the airport compatibility sub-element are minor and focused on timing. The airport compatibility sub-element includes actually two goals. The first is to protect public use airports in the county from nearby incompatible land uses and developments. And goal 13 is to recognize and support county public use airports as essential public facilities and significant economic resources. The narrative of the sub-element is proposed amendments to align with the changes that have occurred in the county since last major update. For instance, Payne Field is now a commercial airport, and that is now discussed in the narrative. Okay, next slide, please. I think we're handing things back off to Steve here for a bit.
Okay, thank you, Sarah. Yes, next slide, please.
Oh, I'm sorry, Commissioner Campbell.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I keep jumping in there. Speaking of the marginalized communities and pollution, there's a lawsuit being run against SeaTac right now in terms of pollution from airplanes. It might be worth paying attention to what the implications of that lawsuit are in those communities. And I don't know if compatibility and how that operates, but certainly the close and residential to Payne Field as it looks to expand might be something to consider.
Yes, thank you for sure.
Okay, moving on to the transfer development rights sub-element. Next slide, please. We've added a new policy to Goal 14. And this policy actually should have been in place before we put it in the code, but we got the cart after the horse or something. We have it in our code here where the county council made by motion designate additional sending areas, particularly rural lands, which are not eligible otherwise for as a TDR sending area if they have some significant conservation, watershed, habitat, and our open space or other values. And so we're just adding a policy that mirrors what we have in the code here. I did want to mention that regarding Commissioner Campbell's comments here, we're also looking at expanding the TDR program into rural areas because right now it only applies to designated forestry and agricultural lands. If there's a significant farming site in our rural designated areas there, they would have to actually go through our docketing process to redesignate to designated ag land, and unless they could get the county council to to take the lead and have it placed in the TDR program by this motion. So that's another thing we're looking at to help try to preserve, protect the any upland farmlands too, is to expand this TDR program into those areas without having to go through any sort of a lengthy redesignation process. Next slide. I think we're back to Sarah. Oh, yeah. Okay. Sorry. Yes.
Was that for me? Okay, cool. Yeah. Thanks, Steve. We'll keep you on your toes. If you could define TDR receiving and TDR sending areas.
Oh, yeah, glad to. Sorry. I may have been for some of you here. Of course, it's been it was over a year and a half ago, brother. Yes, transfer development rights, where the sending area is our lands we're trying to preserve, particularly resource lands, and so those the development rights on those sites can be transferred over to a urban area, so that the transfer comes from the sending site, which is currently it's designated ag and reforestry lands, can be go through our process to get them certified through the county, and once we certify these development rights, the farmer can no longer build additional houses on his land if he has enough land to do that. And that is done through a conservation easement that runs in perpetuity, as placed on the farmland or the portion that he wants to send the development rights off. But anyway, then it goes to a receiving site, which is in urban areas within unincorporated Snohomish County, or to cities in the Puget Sound region that have a TDR program on the receiving end of it. So developers will buy these credits from a farmer, for example, and they can take them and as part of their development proposal, they can include those and get extra dwelling units out of that, a density bonus. And each jurisdiction probably has a different factor that they use, whether it's one credit is in exchange for 8 additional, let's say, apartment units, or 4 additional single-family units. It's up to the jurisdiction how they want to do that conversion factor. So, but those are what we would call the receiving areas. Those in those urban areas that have some type of a TDR program where they will accept, but the jurisdiction will accept these TDR certificates.
Yeah, so they can go, and I understand TDR at its base level. That was the question, was defining the areas, the receiving areas and the sending areas. Can you go back one slide? Yeah. To consider additional TDR sending areas. Okay, that's what I want to make sure I read it right.
Yes, and again, these areas that are outside of what our code currently shows, which again are only lands that are designated for long-term forestry or agricultural activities.
Right. Got it. Thank you.
Okay. Okay, any other questions? Okay, Sarah?
Okay, so now we'll move on to the future land use designations descriptions. Next slide, please. So much of the proposed amendments to the FLUME, or future land use map sub-element of the land use element, includes housekeeping changes like updating references and reformatting things. The section also is proposed to be updated to include references and descriptions of the 2 newly proposed designations in the urban core sub-area of mixed-use corridor and light rail communities. And both of those descriptions are presented here on the slide. And these are the main proposed changes. All right. So this concludes our discussions of the actual sub-elements, and now we'll move on to the public participation. So next slide, please. So the TMA requires early and continuous public participation, and this has occurred to date for the land use element through an opportunity for the public to provide comment on land use issues during the NEPA scoping period, as well as an opportunity for the public to provide comments on the preliminary draft policy amendments during a 30-day public comment period, and new information is posted continuously on the 2024 update project website. The county received nearly 100 comments letters during the land use elements 30-day public comment period, and the public comment themes are provided on the next slide, although all public comments can be found in the index of record. Next slide, please. All right, so here is kind of a visual representation of the themes that we heard in our public comments. So there was support for the new equity sub-element, as well as specific suggestions to amend policy language to be more inclusive. Public expressed desire of the county to retain strong requirements on UGA expansion and to encourage infill development before expanding UGA boundaries. There were also comments requesting strategies to slow growth throughout the county, as well as requests to ensure high quality developments. There were suggestions on how the county should prioritize topics. For instance, some commenters requested that the county prioritize wildlife and the environment above economic development, while others requested economic development over housing. There's a strong desire to protect urban tree canopy and the environment more broadly, as well as to mitigate against climate change. And this was inclusive of requests to direct development away from areas that could be impacted by landslides, flooding, and sea level rise. Public also expressed desire to protect working farms and keep rural growth to 4.5% of the county-wide growth. They also recommended to require more public notices and better public engagement from the county during the preparation of plans like the comprehensive plan. And finally, there were requests to retain the Cathcart-related policies previously proposed for repeal, and there were also comments on specific land use development applications and road projects. So many of the themes discussed in public comment letters were already incorporated into the preliminary draft policies, although public comments also inspired changes to proposed land use element that were included in the briefing today, and as well as the staff report. So as discussed earlier this evening, one major change was including currently marginalized communities within the equity sub-element and throughout the plan. Further, public comments related to the Cathcart-specific policies previously proposed for repeal were taken under serious consideration, and those policies are now proposed to be retained in the element unchanged. Another example of a change induced by public comments relates to the number of comments received with specific strategies to limit rural growth and protect farmlands. These comments inspired in-depth policy discussions in a new policy, Policy 78, that Steve discussed, that was not previously proposed for a public comment. This policy directs the county to evaluate and implement strategies to preserve farmlands, such as potentially increasing the minimum lot size in agricultural areas. Next slide, please. Next month's briefing will include the natural environment element and the parks and recreation element. Any questions that the team here is unable to answer tonight will be responded to via email. And please, public or commissioners, feel free to email any questions or any comments to the update email address, which is 2024 or 2024 update@snowco.org. So this ends our formal briefing presentation, and there's now lots of time for questions or further discussion.
Any questions from commissioners? Commissioner Campbell.
It's me again. So, I raised the point about the different definitions of urban villages, urban centers, countywide centers. And you move the densities from 4 to 6. I'm kind of curious, like the definition at different centers, what the densities look like in those different configurations, like rural communities, et cetera. Is there a differential? Or you don't have to answer the question now. It is something I'm thinking about. Is higher level densities closer to the urban centers and the high capacity light rural communities. And then secondly, the impact of the new legislation that was passed by the legislature on allowing multifamily residential middle housing across jurisdictions, and what the potential impact on that on upzoning some different lands within the county.
Sorry, I lost my mouse. Yes, so those are all great questions. And I think I will be able to answer them more fully, likely after this meeting, discussing them with some of my colleagues. I think part of the answer, though, for the centers depends on the implementing zones in the designations, and those will impact the underlying density allowed. I think, though, there's some assumptions that can be made for those that we can discuss more fully, though. And as for the impact of the new legislation, I also think I want to make sure I touch base with those on my team to make sure that I'm answering that question fully as well.
Any other questions for staff while we have them here? Okay, thank you, Sarah, Steve, and Matthew. Good job.